Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to The Lead. I'm Jake Tapper. We begin this Friday with some breaking news in our world lead. President Obama, the president who ended the Iraq War, is now about to double the number of American troops back on Iraqi soil. The White House announcing it will up the number of military advisors in Baghdad and throughout the country from 1,500 to 3,000. The Obama administration insists the troops will not be in combat, but focused on better positioning Iraqi security forces to battle ISIS. The move also comes with somewhat of a hefty price tag. The administration says it will ask Congress for $5.6 billion for the ISIS campaign, $1.6 billion just to train Iraqi and Kurdish fighters. The timetable for just when these troops will get there, that remains fluid, but there are more and more signs Iraqi security forces desperately need some sort of help. Suicide bombers detonated 3 devices at a military checkpoint in Baghdad near a critical oil field early this morning. The attack killed a senior police officer and wounded 5 others. Here now with all the latest on this administration announcement, CNN Chief National Security Correspondent Jim Sciutto. Jim, where is CENTCOM deploying these troops?
So in addition to this being a massive numerical expansion in the number of troops on the ground, and to be fair, it's double the number that's there now, but it's actually 10 times the number of advisors that were sent there originally, with 300 on June 19th. Think of that over that span of time. But geographically, this is fascinating as well, because to this point, those advisors have been confined to Baghdad and Erbil, 2 relatively safe locations in Iraq, well protected by the Kurds in Erbil, well protected by Iraqi security forces in Baghdad. They're going to now establish 2 more so-called advise and assist centers outside of Baghdad and Erbil. The 2 places that have been discussed are Taji and Anbar province, just to the west of Baghdad. In fact, we reported last week that they were preparing plans to send advisors to Anbar.
And you reported the week before that Anbar was falling into ISIS hands.
Absolutely, 80% controlled now. But in addition to those operations centers, the Pentagon says they're going to establish several sites in northern, western, and southern Iraq to train a further 12 Iraqi and Kurdish brigades. So imagine this. You're going to now have U.S. military advisors, not just in Baghdad and Erbil, 2 additional operation centers outside of Baghdad and Erbil, it is thought, Anbar and Taji, plus several more sites distributed around the country where these Iraqi forces are to train them. Not combat troops, but to be frank here, much closer to the combat than they were before.
And why now, Jim?
Well, what the administration says is that the Iraqi forces have finally been taking the fight to the Iraqis. In fact, they claim, the president in a statement today, that ISIS has, in the words of the White House, suffered a series of defeat in Iraq recently. And it is fair to say that Iraqi security forces have had their first victories in recent weeks. They took back the Mosul Dam, for instance. They took back a key border crossing, Rabia, up on the Syrian border. They took back a town just to the south of Baghdad. These are small victories when you consider the amount of territory controls. But it's their argument that now that Iraqi forces are doing that, it is our assessment that if we help them, they can do more to prepare them for more offensive operations. To be fair, U.S. military officials say that substantial offensive operations by Iraqi security forces are still a number of months off, and you could see these advisors as being sent there to prepare them for that.
So they are portraying this, obviously, not as mission creep. They're saying the mission is the exact same, but certainly, as you point out, it's 10 times the number of troops that were originally sent in June.
Yeah, I mean, look at the steps. June 19th, 300 advisors sent there in a limited role to assess the Iraqi forces. August 8th, you begin the air campaign, which you remember in Iraq only, which you remember at the time they defined purely as protecting the Yazidi people, you know, confined up on that mountain in Sinjar, and protecting U.S. personnel in Baghdad and Erbil. September 22nd, you extend the air campaign into Syria, and over the course of time, clearly the airstrikes have been about more than protecting U.S. personnel or protecting minority groups under threat. They've been about trying to fight back and degrade and destroy ISIS. So you've seen it, whether you use the term mission creep, clearly the mission has expanded, substantially during these last several months.
So the mission and the size of troops have
absolutely
creeped.
Numerically, geographically.
Jim Sciutto, thank you so much for details on how significant this move is to U.S. military operations in the region. Let's go to General Spider Marks. He joins us now on the phone. General, would you try to explain the timing behind this move? Why is the White House announcing this now? Why is it urgent to get 1,500 more troops into Iraq?
Jake, I can't speak to the political reasonings for the expansion of the mission at this point, but I can tell you that clearly what the U.S. wants to do with its coalition partners, as Jim has just described, is you want to reinforce success, and we've given the ISF, the Iraqi Security Forces, an opportunity with the U.S. presence that's on the ground right now, an opportunity to achieve some small victories, which is what it's all about. That leads to confidence. That leads to increased missions for them. And that provides an opportunity for the United States to follow up and say, look, we're reinforcing success. I would suggest that there clearly is a political aspect to this as well. I'm not naive, but I would say what we're seeing on the ground would drive you to this type of a conclusion.
Defense officials have told CNN that part of the reason that the aerial campaign has not significantly rolled back ISIS, especially in Syria, is because the U.S. does not have the intelligence and the reconnaissance personnel to effectively target ISIS leadership. Even though these troops are going into Iraq, will this maneuver help solve that problem? Obviously, 1,500 troops can only do so much, but is it a step in the right direction to solve that problem?
Well, that's a great question. I would assume that the United States certainly is not going to take its eye off of, or its resources off of, the fight in Syria. With the increase of the resources in Iraq to cover down on the Iraqi Security Forces and to bolster them in terms of the train and equip mission, simultaneously the United States is probably supporting as best they can Kurdish fighters, PKK if they can, in order to try to put some very specific targeting against these dispersed targets that exist in Syria. Because there's been success in Syria, specifically by the air campaign, the targets of ISIS have now dispersed. Well, that's a good thing. That decreases their ability to conduct command and control and to try to mass on targets where they'd like to mass. The downside is you now have targets all over the place, and if you wanted to try to continue to attrit those, you have to have a real large number of, I would suggest, special forces type operations that can go after and lay these targets from the ground so you can have close air support going against it. It's a much more expansive mission, but it's one the United States is probably starting to take on anyway. We're just not getting any publicity or media coverage on that aspect.
General Lloyd Austin, the commander of CENTCOM, the U.S. Army general leading the campaign against ISIS, told me this yesterday at a forum on just how many troops it will take to beat back ISIS. He said this: I think it's somewhere between 9,000 and 17,000. He's referring to the number of members of ISIS. Between 9,000 and 17,000. And again, without having the human intelligence on the ground to confirm or deny, it's very difficult. He was expressing concern that he did not have the human intelligence that could tell him how many members of ISIS there were. And I suspect, a guy like General Austin is not going to voice concerns or frustrations publicly, although he came close there by saying that he didn't have the human intelligence that he needed to discern how many members of the enemy he was fighting. Do you think that this is one of the reasons why these men are being deployed?
If you try to separate the two, you have a hard time. These soldiers are being deployed into Iraq to support the Iraqi Security Forces. There will be an associated intelligence collection mission with that. The presence of ISIS throughout the region certainly goes beyond the purview of ISF, the Iraqi Security Forces, to fight outside of Iraq. So there still remains, under General Austin's command, the responsibility to prosecute from the air in Syria and to prosecute now from the ground through an advise and consent type role, the ISF. So yes, there will be an intelligence collection mission to go against the ISIS numbers, but he did voice a concern. When he gives you a number between 9,000 and 17,000, you've essentially got 100% variance in terms of the number. That's a difficult problem that you need to get your arms around, and it does relate directly to precise intelligence collection on the ground.
General Spidermarks, thank you so much. We're also waiting for Pentagon spokesman Rear Admiral John Kirby to come out and brief reporters on the White House announcement that the President has authorized sending 1,500 more troops to Iraq to help advise and train Iraqi security and Kurdish security forces, they say. We'll bring that to you when it happens.